I'd like to show you a little bit of the brush strokes that I used in this painting, in May Wynn's painting. And I used a lot of Mary Cassatt's brush strokes from the new category that I created. And let me show you one of Mary Cassatt's paintings. These are one of her famous paintings, and her subject matter was pretty much children and mothers, very nice warm paintings. And if you take a look at here, and let's go a little close, it's hard to see the real brush strokes in these images, but I'll show you over here that I tried to replicate this feel in the brush stroke that I created. And one of them that I created is called Cassatt Oily Blender, and you will find it under the Cassatt category with this particular icon, and it's a brush that I created for you. And let me just take pure white. Let me add another layer on top, and let me come in, and I'm actually in the oily blender. Let me just go back, and let me come in here and just take the Mary Cassatt oil. There we go. Now, the Mary Cassatt oil is not working. Okay, when I start, and I did that on purpose. I know, I'm making believe, but when I do something like that, and I'm painting on an empty blank layer, I'm showing you that this, when you have that reaction, that means not that there's something wrong with the brush, but it means that this particular brush needs pixels to be applied to it. In other words, if I'll go on the canvas and I come in and paint, it will indeed paint. Okay? Now I'm going to show you how to avoid that particular problem. When we get into the into this image, I'll show you how to avoid that. Let me just show you now how this brush replicates. It looks very much like Mary Cassatt. So I'm adding over here some color. Okay, and then I'm going to come back and notice how it's the same brush strokes like she uses. Look how that looks exactly like that. I'm replicating it really nicely. And then I come back with one of the blenders. If the brush says, if I tagged on a blend, that means that it blends. I want an oily blender. I'm going to come in and I'm going to pull that down. Just like that. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm painting on top of a painting right now just to show you how I am simulating Mary Cassatt's look. And that's looking real nice and painterly. Okay, but let us go back now to May Wynn. And let me put this on the side. So these are the brush strokes that I'm trying to replicate. This look right over here. And I'm going to do that in the clothing on May Wynn. So as you see, I already painted. I got a nice head start before this DVD. And let me come in here now and use those brushes. But I don't want to paint on the canvas. I want to paint on either an empty layer or, in this particular case, because some of these brushes don't work on empty layers, I want to paint on a duplicate of the canvas layer. How do I duplicate a canvas layer in Corel Painter? Well, you need to go to this new tool here, and it's called the Move tool. I take this tool, and while I'm in this tool, I'm highlighting the canvas. I do Command or Control A. And what I did was I selected the entire layer. And now that the entire layer is selected, I hold the Option or the Alt key, and I get a double arrow, and I click in the middle. And what I got is a duplicate of that layer. Because I had that layer in the middle, it skipped it. I'm just going to go and highlight that layer, and I'm going to delete it. So now I have two layers, a duplicate of the canvas layer. So I can go ahead, instead of having to paint directly on the canvas, I can paint on a duplicate of it. And I can turn the eye on and off to see how I proceeded, or I can erase to it, and I don't touch the canvas layer at all. So let me come in with my Mary Cassatt oil. Okay, and let me come in with the color white. Let me just add in a little white in here. Make it a little larger. And let's start adding a little punch to this painting over here, just by exaggerating a little bit of the highlights. A little in here. Let me Option or Alt click the color, and then come in up a little lighter so that I have the color. I'm in the right family, but I want to bring in some highlights. And let's go a little bit heavier. Still not heavy enough. There is another one that I created. It's called Mary Cassatt Thick Oil. And that should do the trick, yes. That's a nicer brush for this particular style that I'm looking at. I applied my brush strokes, and now let me come in with my blender, my oily blender, and let me blend it in nicely. I'm trying to get some dimension. It should look nice and painterly, a little more kick. I tend to lean towards photorealism, and sometimes it looks so photorealistic that I wind up transforming a photograph into a painting that replicates a photograph. Yeah, so I come back in with some more detail and I let those paint strokes just live because it is the photograph that I'm trying to get away from. So let me back away a little bit. Let me just do this and show you before and after, and it's just starting to get a little more punch. Let's come in here now and let me add a little bit of the thick color again. Let me come in with a little larger brush and let me just add it in here, just like that. And then I come in with my blender. I come in with my oily blender, and let's come in and just blend it in nicely like that, and a little more. Now I could have come in with my grainy water and blended, but then it would make it too soft, and I'm gonna come right back to my photographic. So I do use the grainy water on the faces. I do use it to start everything, to get away from the photograph, to get rid of those pixels. But then when I want to get more painterly, I come in with the Cassatt Oily Blender, and I created an oily blender in the other masters as well. I have an oily blender in the GA. I have the oily blender. I have in Sargent. I believe I have the Sargent brush, the Sargent oil. I don't have a blender in here, but I have in Rembrandt. I have the Rembrandt blender as well. And each one lends itself to the look of that particular master. Let's go back to Mary Cassatt, to the oily blender. And I want to add a little more color in here. Let me go back to the thick oil. Let me Option or Alt, pick the color. Let's go into some vibrant colors. Let me add a little something in there. Let's make it a little exciting, and let's come back in with the blender. And I think you get the idea. Put down the color and then just come in and blend it. So that will give me the Mary Cassatt brushstroke, and you can use it on anything that replicates that time period. So that's one of the brush categories that I used in doing the clothing on this particular painting. If you notice, you're starting to see a lot of very interesting brush strokes here that we never saw before. That's pretty real looking, real oily, real bristly. And I created something called the Cassatt Bristle Blender. And if I come in here and I show you, look how that is pulling the color. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? Now these brushes are based on the new Real Bristle brushes. There is a new category called Real Bristle brushes, and they are amazing. They are so real looking, and I am going to devote an entire chapter to them, and we'll do a painting from scratch using those brushes. But right now, let me just show you how I have a few real brushes. I have a real bristle blender in here as well from the Cassatt, and it's based on the same type of brushes from the real category. Come in here and just move your paints around in the direction that you want, and look at those strokes. Look at that. You just see each bristle. That's what it's called, the Real Bristle Blender category. The Real Bristle category. And that looks so painterly. No matter how hard I tried to replicate brush strokes with all the brushes that I had up until version 10, I was never really able to replicate this look. And this is, guys, this is just about as real as it gets. So these brushes you'll find in the Mary Cassatt brush category. And you have a bristle blender and you have a color blend. And these two will be based on the real bristle, and the other ones are oily brushes based on Cassatt's look of her paintings. I know I'm talking and talking, but I'm painting at the same time, so that's okay. Now look at before, which is already painted, and here I took it even a step further, and let's go back to the original, which is right here, and look what we had here. We just had here cloth. That's the photograph, that's the painting, and that looks like a painting. Those are real brush strokes, okay? If I were to come in here with the brush and start pulling with the bristle blender, look at that. I can come directly on the cloth and it's real smooth.